personal knowledge, mainly they joined because of the rise of fascism. In other cases, they joined for reasons which were general reasons. For example, a large number, joined during the campaign which we had for the 2 years preceding the war to improve the conditions of homes for the tenants, and that applied to both Jew and Gentile, and several hundred of those joined. It could have been simultaneous. They were joining for that, plus the anti-fascist struggle, which in the main the Communist Party was leading.
But effectively, the Communist Party in much of the East End was an almost completely Jewish organisation. I know there were Gentile members, but it was overwhelmingly Jewish.
I would say the majority. You used the word overwhelming. No, I'm trying to remember. And for 3 years before the war, I was the secretary, so I would know the membership, and the membership rose at one time to 900. No, as we moved along, quite numbers in industry. We had a very powerful docks group, for example, who were all Gentiles. We built a very good group in the town hall, and 80% of them were Gentiles. By the town hall, I mean municipal employees of all kinds, from clerks to dustmen and so on. I would say that in the period just before the war, there were about 50% Jews and Gentiles. Whereas I would say, and on the Stepney Borough Council, of which I was a member, 1/3 were Jews, and the others Labour, except for me.
Sir Alfred Sherman has said that, talking about his own personal experience, because after all he stayed in the Communist Party for 10 years, it wasn't a sort of brief dalliance of his, he was there for a long time. He said that Jews in the East End joined the Communist Party because they wanted to escape their Jewish identity. They want to become part of a wider proletarian movement. And then lo and behold, they found all they were joining was a Jewish faction.
Well, as you said that, I'm trying to recollect all kinds of faces of friends and comrades I knew. I would say the other way around. I would say that before they joined the Communist Party, they had already given up all aspects of Judaism, both the religious and everything else. That if they joined the Communist Party, it was an indication that they had also turned down the inclinations of some of the people to become Zionists and see their way forward in the never for that purpose. And I have in mind right now a whole number of people who had given up their religion as I did, quite young, had dissociated themselves, had begun to intermarry, both men and women. I would say that what Sherman says may look right, but from my point of view, in the middle of it, and from a longer standpoint, it was more or less the other way. There would be some like that, but I doubt it. I never found myself, for example, I can't remember, and I'm thinking now of dozens of faces of good, worthy people with whom I worked, ever raising Jewish questions. They had discarded it long before. What I did come across very sharply indeed, I don't wish to digress, what I did come very sharply indeed was the Catholic problem. When Catholics who were joining the Communist Party, young Catholics, and therefore were leaving their church, and on one occasion a senior Catholic priest got in touch with me, and we had a talk over tea and discussed how these matters should be handled. Nothing was ever raised with me on the Jewish question by any rabbi or anything at all.
Nevertheless, as you say, the Communist Party in the East End was largely Jewish, at least half Jewish. And you say these were people who had turned their back on observancy. But they were obviously joining in part because they were Jews, because Jews felt especially threatened, both by the rise of fascism in Germany and locally by the black shirts.
Yes, on those two counts, Jews felt especially threatened. But one of the biggest ongoing campaigns, and to the extent that it was ongoing, it was the most outstanding before the war, was the campaign to improve the tenants' conditions. And in many cases, the landlords of those blocks of tenements were also Jews. So therefore, you had a block of tenants where 80% would be Jews, and they were combating a landlord or his company who was also Jewish. So you must fit that in somewhere.
was the high watermark of Jewish communism in the East End, of communism full stop in the East End, was your election in 45 for Mile End. Now here were you, a Jewish communist candidate, unseating a sitting Jewish Labour MP. Now that was a remarkable achievement. What led to that strength of support in 45?
Well, what led to that support can only be judged in the light of the mood, to a certain degree, of the whole nation at the time. And those of us who were adults would always remember the period. There was, firstly, relief. The war, of course, was not yet over. We were still fighting in the Far East. But there was relief. And there was normality. And people were hoping for real normality. They weren't able to contemplate what was going to happen with the next government, whichever it was, Labour or Conservative, and the strict rationing which was maintained, with a number of hardships involved there. But that was the first thing. The second thing was the question of memories. During the war, the party had been, in Stepney in particular, the party had been continuously active. In the stages when the bombing was on, the party was active in the shelter movement. And in fact, I had not been very active personally. I held other positions in the party. In Stepney, I attended my council meetings or so on. And I would say that this was a vote. Just in order to give you one indication, I got 48% in a three-corner vote. Bill Rust in Hackney, also partly Jewish, got 27%. So that's a fair vote. It's a respectable vote. And this is an indication of the support which we were getting. But Bill Jones in Hornsey got 20% in a very difficult three-corner vote. And he was non-Jewish, a school teacher. So therefore there was a mood going around in parts of London which was wider than that limited to the special features of Stepney. I would say there was a kind of personal popularity there which had been built up around my name. I'd been involved in a number of things which got the headlines, though it wasn't intended for that, like the time when we occupied the Savoy Hotel and other things of that kind. And therefore the people realized, firstly, two aspects: policy, personality. On the personality, I haven't got much to add to what I've just said, that I was respected and so on. On the politics, by that time, most of the people at East End Stepney had accepted that whatever mistakes we might have made at the beginning of the war, once we were in the war, we were as hard-working in every respect to win the war as could be, and we gave a lead, and we had our politics. I think that's all.
But here you were contesting probably the most Jewish constituency in Britain, the one with the largest proportion of Jewish voters. Did you and Frankel deliberately compete for the Jewish vote?
No, I never competed for the Jewish vote with anyone. I never spoke as a Jew. Of course, in fact, though I don't deny it, and I have no reason to be worried about it, I was born Jewish, I was brought up Jewish, but I gave up my religion as a matter of my serious thinking, and for no other reason, not for any gain or for anything else. And when I spoke just as an ordinary East London chap, neither Jewish nor anything of the kind. But what did happen was, and I will give you this as an interesting instance, which again is not widely known. When it came to the county council elections for the then London County Council, and they took place early in 1946, we then decided to contest two of the London County Council divisions, Mile End West, where I stood, and Whitechapel. Mile End and Whitechapel. And we picked four candidates. The Stepney Committee and the London District Committee picked four candidates. In each case there was a Jew and a Gentile. Now in the seat which I won, Mile End, we had Jack Gaster, Jewish, Ted Bramley, Gentile. I was particularly interested, now this will make you happy, I was particularly interested to see how the voting went. And I asked the organisers to get the scrutineers to keep an eye on things. I wanted to see where people were voting double, by which I mean the Labour Party were the main contestants. The Labour Party were putting up their candidates, and whomever they put up we were not concerned with. But there were quite a number. There were, I think the figure was about 200 out of 2,500 who voted one Labour and one Communist. Well, many people did that, that's fair enough. But also, there seemed to be a relationship on the Jewish side, so that in the case of Bramley and Gaster got more votes than Bramley, though Bramley was the most popular man. In the other ward, we had again Bill Carver, Gentile, Michael Shapiro, Jewish, both capable people, both fine people, you see. And there now, because that ward, that area extended right into Docklands, it was Bill Carver who got 200 more than Michael Shapiro on the split votes. Now that's indicative of the mood of people.
When you got into the House of Commons, you were part of a very large Jewish intake. It just so happened there was a tremendous number of Jewish Labour MPs.
22.
But as a proportion of the population, you should have only expected to have perhaps 3 or 4. And previously there'd been very few Jewish MPs, and most had been Conservatives and Liberals. And here there was a rather significant block of Jewish MPs, and not a single Jewish Conservative in 1945. Were you aware of that? Well, one, but he didn't take the party whip, I seem to remember.
Correct.
He was an independent Conservative. rather strange guy, as far as I can make it. But were you aware of that at the time, that in a sense Jews had arrived in the House of Commons in large numbers? Did you act as a bloc with Jewish Labour MPs on any issues?
Well, I would answer the second question. Of course, I've got an interesting story. But in the first place, about working as a bloc, but in the first place, I was not actually aware of it. I began to be friendly with a number of people. But and the one with whom I got very close indeed, but it wasn't because he was Jewish, was Sidney Silverman. He was a left-wing man, a good socialist. He was never a Zionist. He was connected with the World Jewish Congress, which was not a Zionist organization. And he was a very good chap. He was by profession a solicitor. He helped me subsequently when I presented my first private member's bill. And we worked in great harmony. And I was with him 2 days before he died, many years later. Otherwise, I was quite friendly with Mikado and a number of others, but closer with Sidney. On the other hand, most of my friends would have been some of the left-wingers who were there, some of those who were expelled, for example, like Platts Mills and others. Now, with regard to a bloc, no, there was never a bloc to my knowledge. There might have been a bloc within the Labour Party. So the position was, as you rightly say, there was an independent Conservative, and there were, I think the exact figure was 22 Labour and myself. The question of Jewishness never came up, except on one occasion when someone insulted me. But what did arise at one time was this, which was never published, and I could write a whole article on it. I received a letter from Dr. Weitzman, the head of the Zionist movement, that he was calling a meeting in one of the committee rooms of Jewish MPs, and he'd be glad if everyone would come. So I thought it over, and I spoke with my colleague, Willie Gallagher, and I decided to go. And about 18 were there, of the possible 24, and Lipson turned up to the first, as I did. And there was Dr. Harry Weitzman and Ben-Gurion. And they were putting us into the picture, the up-to-date negotiations which were going on at the time. They were very tough and prolonged. The Americans were playing dirty as to how many Jews they were prepared to allow to enter the country, and they were arguing in numbers. And Weitzman looked very tired, very serious and very tired. But in the outline which was being presented by both of them, they gave a report, both intelligent people, and a number of questions were asked by different chaps. And the Ben-Gurion was much more ebullient. And one Labour chap then put the question to him, you want people from all over the world to come, not only the people who are now displaced in Europe. And Ben-Gurion said, we want them to come from England, from America, everywhere, and build up a new Jewish society. It wasn't yet called Israeli, they were used by Jewish. And this Labour chap said to him, not provocatively, but fairly, it was quite a fair meeting. But what will you do? It's only a small country. And at that time, I think the figure which was used were 12 million Jews in the world. And that country couldn't have really managed to hold that. He then answered this. He said, when we want more land, we will take it. And Ben-Gurion said that. Weizmann, sitting next to him, then bowed his head and didn't look at the audience for the next few seconds. It was clear Weizmann did not agree with his tactics, and did not agree, even if he did, with his wisdom in saying so to a couple of dozen people. That was the only time there was ever a joint meeting.
To what extent do you think, Zionism was becoming an increasing force among Anglo Jewry in that period, and the creation of the State of Israel, the cockleshell boat, the influx of Jews back to Palestine arose tremendous emotions among British Jews. To what extent do you think Bevan's change of heart, what was seen as going back on his promises to assist Jews in travelling to Palestine, weakened what was at that time a very strong link between the left and British Jewry?
I watched the proceedings very carefully over this, and I was involved in a number of not organised talks but chats with Labour people and so on, including, as I mentioned, Sidney Silverman. Now, I watched Bevin very carefully. Now, I had some knowledge and experience because of my political position with trade unionists. And though he came over as a very forceful character, his background, upon which he built his reputation, was trade unionism. I don't think he knew much about world politics, and that he was appointed as foreign minister. I don't think he knew much about general politics. For example, he wouldn't know much about social problems. But he would know, of course, about industrial and working class problems. I think that he didn't know how to tackle the Palestinian problem, and was being guided mainly by his own officials around him. Now, those officials in Whitehall on the Palestine problem were almost 90% pro-Arab. That was their background, that was their education. Not pro-Arab with the poor Arab beggar, but pro-Arab with the rich Arab sheikhs with whom they had engaged, some of whom they had met in the course of their affairs previously and so on. And I think that Bevin was impressed by that. Ultimately, nevertheless, he showed himself very antagonistic, and I've read that period very closely. I have inside many books on the subject. And what did happen was that to some degree, whether behind the scenes, our side, I won't say General Cunningham was involved, but whether behind the scenes our side were involved with the manoeuvres with the then King of Transjordan and so on, I don't know. But the handling of the matter in the spring of 1948 could have been done very differently, I'm sure of that. And Bevin must be blamed for that, whether he did it knowingly. Now, people have said he's an anti-Semite. Well, anyone who ever says an unkind word is then told he's an I've been called an anti-Semite, is then called anti-Semite. I would say it was just his ignorance more than his worked-out anti-Semitism that was the cause. I have no reason to think that in the course of his activity, meeting, for example, say, with Jewish Labour MPs or Jewish trade union officials, that he would have acted in that way with them.
But to what extent, though, did Bevin's policy disrupt the link between Jews and the left, a link which was apparently very firm in 1945, but by 1950 was nothing like so firm?
Well, you use the word left because there's left and far left. And Bevin might have been called a man of the left because compared to Churchill he was on the left, that is true. And I would say that in some respects he was to the left of Attlee, whose position was always for me a nebulous one as to where he stood. Well, you see, you're talking of a period where there were many other factors, aren't you? In those 3 or 4 years that you're speaking of, until 1950, say, you had, this is what you really had. The first thing which impressed Jewish people, and many others of course, here in England, in Britain, was the reports which were then coming out of the extermination of the Jews. The word Holocaust was introduced at one stage. It has a certain connotation. Extermination of the Jews. Planned extermination by a government which had never been known of before in our modern times. When that came out, it shook people. And I would say that when that happened, and simultaneously the struggle was going on to establish the State of Israel, many people who basically were non-Zionists, whether they were on the left or anything else, they could have been liberal-minded people, but non-Zionists, for any reason, began to say, well, it would be good if the Jews had a national home. In saying that, the Zionists then added them to their supporters, but it was not necessarily so. And what I'm telling you now is on the basis of many conversations which I had at the time, because I used to speak at many meetings and lots of people would speak with me and so on. Now with regard to the Zionist aspects, many of the people who were supporting the campaign for the Zionists to get their feet into Israel, into that part of Palestine, were supporting them not for Zionist motivations and nothing to do with the old Bible, which I will come to. They were talking only from that particular angle. The Zionists liked to suggest that they had been won over, and from a certain angle you could say they were won over until round about after 1967. And in 1967, when the battle there between the Israelis and the Egyptians was nearly lost, and then they won because of the maneuvers which one particular general was able to accomplish, and for a few weeks, every Jew I met, almost, just was proud of what the Jews had done militarily, which they'd never been called on to do, so far as I know, since the time of King David, and that's a few months gone, and so on. And after that, it began to recede, and it receded further with the events in Lebanon a few years later. And therefore, the reason why I give you this information in that order is because there was nothing deep lying in people. There was nothing instinctive about it. The mass of the Jewish people were already coming over to be before the war. May I go on this point? You'll find it interesting. When you phoned me and we spoke about it, I looked up my old folders, but every few years I start destroying them. Nevertheless, I found a folder headed Jews with a whole number of cuttings and one or two notes in it, but they didn't go back far enough. I had somewhere, I must have disposed of it, a cutting from 1938, before you were born. It was from the Daily Telegraph, and it was in the form of a long letter, almost the size of an article. And I'd cut it out because of what it said, and I'm repeating now within my recollection. He was, the then chief rabbi wrote this letter, very worried about one particular thing, assimilation. Actually giving figures according to their records, I suppose, which they had somehow. And in those days the Jewish population was regarded also as around about the 400,000 mark. And what he was concerned about was that a large percentage each year of marriages were of Jewish young men was with non-Jewish girls. Not so much in the case of the girls, Jewish girls, because they were more attached to their homes, but it was Jewish young men. And he gave the figures. Now this was 1938. And this is exactly what I'm saying. And of course he was speaking for the whole country. I can only speak personally for East London, with my knowledge there. This was a trend which was then going on, nothing to do with politics. Well, not really. Maybe the two were going together. Of the way young Jewish people were thinking, and that would be both middle class, university trained, and working class chaps who would go out to work once they left school at the age of 14 and so on. And that was the trend, and I was witnessing that trend, and I was involved in it, at that time. Of course, lots of problems came my way from people who sought my advice on things. Then, of course, came the war. And then there was a hiatus there. The war was the war. And then subsequently, of course, after the war, with the disclosures which came about, people began to change. And members of my party, middle-class Jewish members of my party, I watched them changing their views. Sometimes after sensible, perhaps heated, sensible discussions, but sometimes, and in the main, and many of them good chaps and decent, and women, just opting out.
But why was this? Was this Zionism? Was this assimilation? Was this disillusionment with class politics?
I think in it somewhere, I don't like using this four-letter word, in it somewhere there was a touch of fear.
Fear about their status as Jews?
Fear about their status as Jews. If it could happen once, you see, if you lived through, one had lived through that period, firstly there was the war and all the destruction of the war and everything else. And then gradually there were the disclosures of what happened. More and more they came out. I myself was in Poland in 1946 January, officially a member of parliament with other parliamentarians. And we saw Auschwitz and all those things, and we gave reports. And what happened there was that many people, either thinking people who could work things out for themselves, like it's almost like doing a mathematical proposition, or otherwise just by feeling, felt we ought to stick together. And this kind of feeling had not been seen during the years of the war. It was before the war because of the mostly fascists and so on in England, and the threats being made in the broadcast from America, from Germany, and so on. I believe that was a factor, fear. And fear brought people together. If I give you a short anecdote, but I'll make it brief. My wife and I were on holiday in Italy. And we were at a hotel, and there was a young couple there, and the chap came over. This was in those years, about 19, in the 50s. And the chap came, he said, Phil Piratin. I said, yes. He said, have a drink. And I knew him, and then he introduced his wife. Then I remember that she had been in the Communist Party, both of them. And then they were talking, chatting very pleasantly. But she, at one point, having said of her days in the Young Communist thing, spoken, said, we now live in Edgware. Everyone in the street is Jewish. And my wife, who was very intelligent and very bright and very quick on the comebacks, said, you mean you live in a middle-class ghetto like your grandparents escaped from? She didn't know what to answer. The chap who was brighter, and he was one I really knew, he looked at me and he was a bit shamefaced. They had been members of the Communist Party of that generation, and he didn't say this, but seemed to be happy, I won't say proud, that everyone there is, therefore they had no trouble with their neighbours. This is a derivative of fear of a certain kind. That's a true story. That they've acquired
in those late 30s and the 40s, there was this very strong association between Jews and the left. Most politically active Jews were on the left. Most MPs who were Jewish were certainly on the left. And if we look at the situation now, it's reversed. You've got Lord Jakobowicz, the Prime Minister's favourite cleric. You've got more Jewish Conservative MPs than Labour MPs. And the whole, what you might call Jewish belt, Golders Green, Finchley, Edgware, not so much Wembley, but going right over to Redbridge, all Conservative. Why that change?
Well, my first point is to make a comment. It would be very interesting to see at the next general election what happens now. Now the polls show that Labour has a majority of 13 or so % over the Tories. And if this works out all around, it means that Mrs Thatcher is seriously challenged in her own constituency of Finchley, not far from here. You will then see how they will react. What I think, well, I would say, well, I've got to go into wider politics. It is true in these 10 years that certain sections of people, and in certain geographical areas more than others, have benefited from Thatcher's policies. They won't like what's going to happen to them in the poll tax and all kinds of other things, but in the main they benefited. And I would say that therefore that section of better paid workers and lower middle class Jews likewise have benefited along other British citizens. To that degree therefore, it's not so much that they've acquired Conservative Party interests, it is that they have discarded working class interests. And they look around them, and many working class are now driving a car, chaps are now driving a car, and they look around them, and therefore they get the impression that that's how it generally is, and therefore we're living in that way. And I think that the mood today, as I said, it may change. For example, if it does change for those people who vote Jews who vote Conservative, I believe that they would prefer to vote Liberal. But in view of the whole state of the middle parties now, most Jews who tend to be sensible will not vote Liberal, and if they are going to change, they will switch to Labour. For the reasons, I think that A, they are content. There's been a certain progress of this kind during the whole of these last 10 years, and so on. One can see it in other countries too. And we come now to a fundamental question, which is what Sherman is hinting at. The concept of socialism, as we understand it, and now for the moment, setting aside some of the terrible blunders which they've made over in Eastern Europe, the concept of socialism is something which many Jewish people, I remember this in debates years ago, don't feel gives scope for their entrepreneurial capabilities. And therefore, when they come to look at it, and they say that they're doing well, I myself spoke some years ago, it was accidental in a way, a relative of mine phoned me. Her sister was the chairman of a Jewish society in North London, and would I address them? And I went there, and there were about 60 elderly Jewish men and women. And I spoke about socialism, and why I was a socialist, why I had been and why I was. I remember Communist Party, basically I'm a socialist. So. And at question time and others, people then got up and spoke quite freely. It was quite amiable in the main. And one woman said, all right, I know what socialism is, but my husband has worked hard, and now we have a nice home, and now we are living very comfortably. Why should I give it up for socialism, etc., etc.? Well, this was a very primitive question. I wasn't sure how to answer it on the spot. But I would say that little anecdote explains a frame of mind. This was Southgate, North London. It explains a frame of mind. See, most of them, the chairlady said that most of them had come at one time from East London, and they were now 60 and 70. And I was the speaker, and I'd come from East London, and therefore I thought we had much in common. But no, they might have been even rebels as young people. Now they were steady, staid, I won't say sober, steady, staid people, etc. Now that's what happened, and then that's another true story. And these things condition your mind, and it's this on this basis I'm answering you. I can't go much further. You see, I think that Sherman's making a wide statement which can, I won't say easily, but which can reasonably be shifted Firstly, not all Jews think the same way, but we're talking now of Jewish professional and business people. Small business people, well, the business people really are all most generally Tories. When the chief rabbi speaks in that way, and he gets his earnings, whatever it is, and his kind of condition of life, it's mainly on the basis of the support from the rich people.
But you're effectively saying Jews have moved from left to right because they've moved from working class to middle class. Yakovovitz says something rather different, doesn't he? He says that Thatcherism reflects deeply held Jewish spiritual values and teachings, particularly about the importance of the family, about the importance of self-reliance, dragging yourself up by your own bootstraps. And that's why he suggests that there is this link between Jews and Thatcherism.
He may be right. I'm trying to think now, in the light of the limited number of those people with whom I mix currently. He may be right. There's a certain kind of family feeling which is retained in middle-class Jewish circles, which is more easily broken outside those circles, in among ordinary English houses, Gentiles and so on. How strong that is, I don't know, but it is true. I have seen it. And there may be an element of truth in it, but it's not the whole answer. Because one of the things which is it's not inherent. One of the things which Jewish people learn in their upbringing, if they study Jewish rituals and so on, is the question of considering the underdog. This ranks very high. The word tzedakah means charity, is very high in the Jewish community, and Sherman would know that, of course, you see. And therefore, many of them will feel that much more kindly, I'm not saying this in a nasty way, than the average non-Jew, when they see the distress, like the embankment problems, the cardboard boxes, and know about that. Nevertheless, these people keep to themselves, and one of my regrets, and I don't mind being quoted on it, is that too many Jews who are in the position to support various charities confine their efforts only to Jewish requirements, and not much wider. And this is a very sad thing. I mean, you take the present position, which is in the currently everyone's discussing, the problem of South Africa, and the needs of the movement there and the people there and so on. And all kinds of people are subscribing and showing sympathy. You hardly hear a word about that within the Jewish community as such. And you certainly hardly hear a word from the Jewish religious leaders, the rabbis. And while they're always calling for charity, and they are very charitable, it's always within the narrow circle of Jewish people, either here and of course in Israel. I regret that. This is a turning in.
Let me ask you one final question, if I may. Professor Ivor Crewe has coined the phrase Jews and socialism. Let me say that again. Jews and socialism, the end of a beautiful friendship. Was it a beautiful friendship, and is it over?
Well, you're comparing two things. Jews are people. Socialism is a philosophy. Yes. It's not a friendship. You can't have a friendship for philosophy. The Jews turned to socialism, I think. This is where I disagree with Sherman, in part. I know my Bible probably better than he did. I went to a Jewish college, among other things, and as far as I can recall it. Now, the Jewish motivations, the moral code in Jewry, is there. It's a good one. It's likewise copied in the Christian code. And I would say that many Jewish people, from the point of view of the code, would see that a socialistic society could more provide for their operating their code than a capitalist. To use an ugly word, I don't want to bring in ugly words in this conversation. Capitalism includes an element of greed. Socialism definitely precludes it. It's as simple as that. And therefore, I don't think that he's right in making these general points.
So it wasn't a beautiful friendship and it's not over?
No, it's not over. And I think that if it is the next opportunity, I'm talking now of our own country, the next opportunity will occur when I hope the Labour Party win the next election, and the then Labour government will start introducing measures in such obvious contrast to some of the nasty things which we've had in the last 10 years, that both Jews and Gentiles, middle class and working class, will open up their eyes to what then becomes first elementary steps in a socialist Britain.